newspapers in Washington, D.C. by the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. Two of them were basically scandal sheets. They were tabloids. One was called the Washington Star. And they dogged Douglas. And they dogged if one of his sons had a bankruptcy, it's all over the press. If Rosetta, his daughter's husband, Nathan, was being a ne'er-do-well again and wandering off and their marriage was in trouble, that was in the press. If Douglas's son-in-law sued him, which he did, that was in the press. Everything that happened to his extended family tended to get into the press. So it become, the older Douglas is the part that we don't tend to know, and it was the part that opened up to me in a very special way for this book because of a private collection I was blindly lucky to encounter, owned by an African-American collector named Walter Evans, a collector extraordinaire who lives in Savannah, Georgia, who opened his collection in his home to me for many weeks of research on his dining room table. And it's the coolest archive I've ever been in. Anyway, but that collection is essentially all about the last third of Douglas's life because the core of it are 10 huge Douglas family scrapbooks that were kept by Douglas's sons over the last third of their father's life. And it opened up a whole world of that part of Douglas's story that we just have never had access to.
And you wrote, you printed in the book many of those letters, even letters to his son, letters they wrote back, the kinds of situations that he would go through personally. And then he was under attack. But let me just push you on one point, and then I want Dr. Dyson to weigh in on it.
Sure.
When Lincoln was involved in the Civil War, Lincoln was not a bleeding liberal. He was not one that felt blacks were equal. And it was Douglas and others that fought with him to allow blacks to join the Union Army.
Right.
And when the Confederates were advancing, some of the generals was in the South said, we need help. And Lincoln, therefore, reluctantly let blacks sign the Union Army. So in many ways, when we say Lincoln freed the slaves really freed Lincoln. Because had they not joined the Union Army,
Right.
the Confederates might have won the Civil War.
And Lincoln came to admit the latter, that without those 10 or 11% of the Union Army and Navy that were African American, the Union may not have won the war. Actually, at the beginning of the war, for the first year, 61 into 62, Douglas in his newspaper, and you may know Douglas as an autobiographer, you may know some of the great speeches, but Douglas also was a brilliant journalist. He mastered in the 16 years of his newspaper, the North Star, which becomes Frederick Douglass's paper, he mastered that short form political editorial, which is a different kind of writing than the big orations or autobiography. But in that first year of the war, when the Union war effort was not explicitly to destroy slavery, and indeed the Lincoln administration's policy was to try, if possible, to return fugitive slaves to their owners in the South, if possible, which turned out not to be very possible for Union officers. Lincoln had few more ferocious critics than Douglas. At one point, Douglas called Lincoln the most powerful slave catcher in America. Now, that's going to change, though. And we need to make careful judgments about this. And we have in the room one of the greatest Lincoln scholars, Eric Foner, who wrote a book all about this. So I'm going to be careful here. And I'll get corrected over a beer later. But seriously, what Douglas slowly but surely finds a way to shoulder up to Lincoln. Trust is another matter at first, but he shoulders up to Lincoln in serious ways with the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation of September 1862 and with the final proclamation of January 1863. And here's the last point on that. The The final proclamation had two very significant changes from that first proclamation, which was this attempt to get the South to lay down their arms and say sorry and come back into the Union, which was not going to happen. Two things in the final proclamation, or two elements of it, that are very important. One is that it had no provision for colonization or removal of black people from America, which had been a policy of the early Lincoln administration, and nothing animated Frederick Douglass's anger in the war quite like the efforts of the government